Could the dollar be dethroned? Several developing countries already use the yuan for bilateral trade with China, including two of Latin America's biggest economies. Last week, Bolivia's president announced he's open to doing the same. Could this be the beginning of the end for dollar hegemony? I'm Andrea Sankey, and today's newsmaker is the U.S. dollar. Various countries and cryptocurrency holders have batted the idea around for years, finding a real alternative to the dollar's global dominance. Earlier this year, China and Brazil signed deals to set up a yuan clearing arrangement to facilitate their bilateral trade. And now Bolivia is signaling its interest in using the yuan as well. Of course, just over a decade ago, it was Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies that some argued would replace the dollar and even the banks. Well, that didn't happen. And today, the U.S. dollar remains the planet's reserve currency. But could that be about to change? Let's take a look.
Last week, Bolivian President Leung expressed a willingness to use Chinese currency for international trade. It comes as the country suffers from dollar scarcity. Once dubbed an economic miracle, the South American nation is now on the brink of an economic crisis, and the president believes it may be time to move with the times.
The two largest economies in the region are already trading in yuan in agreements with China, and it is going to be the trend in the region.
Those two economies are Brazil and Argentina. The former signed a deal with China to trade in yuan in March. Brazilian President Lula da Silva questioned the world's reliance on the dollar in his trip to China last month.
Every night I ask myself, why should every country have to be tied to the dollar for trade? Why can't we trade in our own currency?
Similar to Bolivia, Argentina is also running out of dollars. It's in the middle of its worst economic crisis in years, with inflation over 100% and an economy heading towards recession. As a result, Argentina will now pay for Chinese imports in yuan rather than dollars.
It allows us to maintain the level of activity, maintain the volume of imports, maintain the rhythm of trade between Argentina and China, and maintain the levels of economic functioning that Argentina needs.
The de-dollarization trend is also in Chinese interests, as the country wants to break the dollar's global domination. For decades, international trade transactions have been priced in US dollars, especially for major commodity markets like energy and grains. This gives the US power. The US weaponized the dollar against Russia.
Benefits from having the reserve currency, one of the most obvious is, of course, sanctions. If you control the reserve currency, you're able to impose sanctions, as we've done on Russia, to considerable effect.
To cope with sweeping Western sanctions over the war in Ukraine, Russia has also ramped up its use of the yuan. But how likely is it really that the status quo will change? Achieving reserve currency status is not a formal process. It's more like a popularity contest. The asset or currency that most central banks across the world prefer to hold in reserve is essentially the winner. Although China is the third largest trading nation in the world, their currency only accounts for 3% of global trade. So while China's economy and trade flows are large enough to support such a move, the country would need to convince foreign central bankers to start holding the Chinese yuan in reserve. Analysts' opinions differ widely on whether this could actually happen.
So if you want to be a reserve currency, so-called, you need a bond market, you need a securities market, a big one. And you need a lot of other features, a network of dealers, underwriters, settlement, clearance, custodians, depositories, hedging options, repo, futures, options, et cetera. And above all, you need the rule of law. Who trusts the Chinese? Nobody. Who trusts the Russians, really? Well, nobody.
But most analysts believe a threat to the dollar's dominance is still decades away. But as more countries move toward the yuan, the king dollar could be dethroned.
So joining me now to debate the state of the U.S. dollar as the global reserve currency are from Hong Kong, China strategist Andrew Leung, from London, senior market strategist at ActivTrades Mike Ingram, And from Managua, Nicaragua, journalist and editor at Geopolitical Economy Report, Ben Norton. Thanks all so much for being with me. Mike, I'll start with you as the market analyst. Give us your take on where the dollar is going. As I've said, we've been hearing about it for years, but that fundamental shift away from the dollar never actually seems to come. Is that changing now?
I actually don't think so. I think it's not unreasonable to think over a very long period of time. Perhaps we'll see rather more Chinese renminbi in reserve assets and maybe a slightly lesser share of dollars. But I think a bit of historic perspective is actually worthwhile revisiting. As you say, we seem to be having this conversation, and it seems to not be happening. One of the arguments for China becoming the preeminent reserve asset seems to be, well, China is by some measures already the world's largest economy. Therefore, at some point in time, it's going to be a reserve asset. I would simply point out this, is that the United States became bigger than the UK economy in the early 1880s. It was only after 2 world wars, some point after 1945, that the US dollar became the preeminent global currency. And since then, we've been talking about tripolar world of global currencies, maybe the German Deutschmark, which obviously now doesn't exist, and the Japanese yen. That didn't happen. The euro, since its inauguration, has had relatively slow progress in terms of being a reserve asset. And of course, most recently, we've had people touting Bitcoin as the global reserve currency. So none of that's happened. And so I think, if the dollar is on its way out, it's going to take a very, very long time for it to get there.
Let me just ask you, Mike, quickly. I mean, is it a pure win for a country to be the world's global reserve policy? Global reserve currency. Or is there a level of kind of responsibility and risk that comes with it that maybe not every country should envy?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, there used to be this phrase out there called exorbitant privileged. There's like, we're privileged to be the reserve currency, but you actually pay, in some ways, pay a high price. And of course, it is actually quite difficult to control the liquidity when there's so much of it sloshing around in the global financial system. Of course, the flip side of that, a lot of these dollar reserves are in the central banks of what would generally be regarded as emerging market currencies, countries. And, they also have a hard time of it, particularly in the sort of current environment where US rates have been rising. And to some extent, those emerging market central banks have been forced to sell their dollar reserves in order to support their own domestic currencies. And in fact, so some of the most recent decline, by the way, of the dollar in reserves is actually a function of the strong dollar. Ironically, it's not about a weak dollar.
Ben, let me get your take, because I know some that focus on the economy, especially in developing countries, have been saying for a long time that the dollar's hegemony has to come to an end. But is it maybe wishful thinking on the part of some leaders in these developing economies themselves?
Well, it's not wishful thinking. I mean, we're already seeing a de-dollarization. It's not something that is going to happen potentially in the future. It's happening right now. I do agree that it's not going to happen in 1 year, even 5 years. We're talking about a process that's going to take 10 or 20 years, but we already see it beginning. The Financial Times has reported, citing the well-known former Morgan Stanley currency analyst, Stephen Jen, that the share of the dollar in global foreign exchange reserves dropped precipitously from 73% in 2001 to 47%, less than half in 2022. And there's a reason for that. Of course, one of the reasons is because the dollar is very strong. That is certainly a factor. Many analysts would say the dollar is overvalued. And for a lot of countries in the global south that rely on imports, it's become prohibitively expensive to import things like energy or fertilizer. And the war in Ukraine has made that even worse. But another significant factor is Washington's use of sanctions. And we cannot have a discussion of de-dollarization without talking about the abuse of sanctions. The United States has right now sanctions on 27% of the countries in the world. A well-known economist, Francisco Rodriguez, reported on that recently in the Financial Times. And what this has led to is a political drive, not just an economic drive, to seek alternatives to the US dollar. Last year, the Western powers froze $300 billion in US dollar and euro denominated assets belonging to Russia's central bank. This means that many countries in the BRICS system, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, and BRICS curious countries are looking for alternative payment mechanisms. The ASEAN countries of Southeast Asia just held their summit in Indonesia, in which they signed an agreement with 10 Southeast Asian member states calling for using their local currencies in trade and moving away from the dollar. So yes, it's certainly true that the dollar does dominate, especially in financial markets. But what we're also seeing is a move toward the de-dollarization of commodity trading. So for instance, China has just done its first transaction buying liquefied natural gas from the United Arab Emirates in its own currency, the renminbi, going through a French company, TotalEnergies. Entonces, so what we're actually seeing here is, again, it's not a drastic decline overnight. And I disagree with the people who say that there's going to be hyperinflation. Certainly, the dollar is very dominant, in particular in capital markets. China has expressed no interest in deregulating its capital markets. But with the de-dollarization of commodity trading, especially among the BRICS countries, what we're seeing is a move toward a multipolar currency world where the dollar is certainly not going to go away, but it's going to be one of several different currencies used not only for international trade, but also held in foreign exchange reserves.
Right. Okay. And I mean, that's the point. Andrew, let me get you in the mix here. You know, it's not going to happen overnight. I think everyone can accept that. Ben seems to think 10 or 20 years. Mike definitely doesn't agree on that one. But I think, Andrew, we do have to distinguish between de-dollarization and the actual end of the dollar's dominance globally.
Well, I entirely agree that the U.S. dollar still remains dominant because this position has been entrenched for so long. So even though the share of the U.S. dollar in the international foreign currency reserve system has been dropping, as pointed out by the other guests, it still accounts for something like 60% of the foreign currency reserve globally. However, there are significant undercurrents happening, as pointed out by the other guests, and countries like, of course, not only Russia, Saudi Arabia, France, Brazil, the BRICS countries, Kenya, ASEAN countries, and even India are trying to use other currencies for their international trade. Because the fact remains that the biggest trading nation on earth is not the United States, it's China. China is the world's biggest trading nation. 158 countries around the world have China as the largest trading partner, compared with only 58 for the United States. So if countries trade with China, why do they have to use the US dollar? People are beginning to ask, especially as pointed out by the other guests. The United States weaponizing the US dollar as sanctions. And then the sanctions have been going on for a long, long time, and then disrupting other countries' economy. And now even using the dollar to bifurcate and decouple the world economy in different ways. So this is affecting the interests of many developing countries. Now, people will say, oh, well, forget about the developing countries. But on the other hand, according to the Conference Board recent research, the developing economy would account for 60% of the world economy by the year 2035 using purchasing power parity measurements. So I think the dynamics are changing, and no doubt that the renminbi is not going to replace the US dollar as the reserve currency, but it's definitely going to to assume a much more important position as a preferred trade currency.
Okay. Mike, let me come back to you and ask you really, if at this point Russia hadn't invaded Ukraine and the sanctions hadn't come in, also arguably making China worry as well that it could receive the same treatment at some point, Would we be talking about this right now?
Well, it's always tricky with counterfactuals, isn't it? Well, I mean, I think, you know, if you actually look at Russia's own actions, they were quite proactive in replacing their own dollar reserves with other currencies. And if you look at how that tops up right now, Russia accounts for something like a third of global renminbi reserves, and that's helped to pump that number up. Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, it's legitimate to say that the US has to some extent, you know, weaponized its currency and Russia's access to the global financial system. And there was talk, of course, of Russia being cut off completely from the SWIFT payment system. But, you know, what I would counter with initially is that, you know, any jurisdiction which is going to have a dominant position is likely to exercise whatever influence it can when it can. And, you know, if you think that China wouldn't exercise force if it had those levers to pull, then I think you're probably deluding yourself. One thing, by the way, that I would want to revisit, by the way, is some of the numbers which were churned out. I mean, I haven't seen Stephen Jen's research, but I point out with all respect to Stephen, he has been wrong before. 2001, which seems to be the base year that everybody's keen on touting, was a peak year for reserves because in the aftermath of the Asian crisis, a lot of Asian countries were stockpiling dollars as a buffer. So I think as a baseline, that's probably a little bit questionable. And I think as previous speaker mentioned, I think that the number of 47% and change of current reserves is also questionable, because I think the IMF have actually commented that it's closer to 55. So, you know, as they say, lies, damns, lies and statistics, a lot of numbers out there. I think there has been a trend decline in dollar reserves over the last 20 years. I think it averages out something like 0.6% per annum. But I wouldn't necessarily say it's absolutely precipitous.
Got it. Mike, you know, quickly, I asked you before about, you know, the wins and loses of being the dominant reserve currency for the entire planet. One of China's issues is, and why many argue the yuan could not ever be the global reserve currency, is because China controls that currency. Wouldn't they have to float yuan freely in order to even try to compete with the dollar as the reserve currency?
Yeah, I think there's certainly an issue of what I call broadly institutional integrity. I think one of the things that held the US dollar back actually from, you know, becoming the global reserve currency was a lack of central bank. I mean, the US didn't have one until 1919, the Federal Reserve. You've actually seen moves within China in more recent years for the Chinese Communist Party to have exert more direct control over financial policy. There was some legislation pushed through, I believe, in March to extend their oversight of the central bank. So yeah, I mean, I think that is obviously a concern. I'm not saying that the Federal Reserve or the US Treasury has necessarily covered themselves in glory in recent years. But you know, in currencies, it is a relative game, and you know, the question is, do you feel more comfortable with the regulatory regime as is in the direction of travel in the US, against where you think you are with China and where you think that's going, and that becomes actually more critical as we move to an era of central bank digital currencies.
Okay, Ben, let me come back to you, because, you know, we've heard about this potential creation of a BRICS currency. You've talked about the creation of a pan-Latin American currency, but I mean, Argentina and Brazil, who would be the main drivers of such a currency, they do not have the most responsibly run economic policy, in huge part due to corruption. So why would anyone trust a currency created by countries that are in a constant boom and bust cycle, in large part of their own creation, because of the lack of responsibility?
Well, it is certainly true that countries in South America have gone through constant boom and bust cycles. I would disagree with the claim that it's because of their own responsibility. Certainly, there always are criticisms in any country, but I mean, this gets to the core of the problem. One of the fundamental problems in a country like Argentina, for instance, is that it has so much external debt denominated in US dollars. This is one of the reasons that explains why countries in the region are seeking alternatives. Argentina, really for about 200 years, was first trapped constantly in debt denominated in the British pound and since in the US dollar. And it's constantly bleeding all of its foreign currency in order to try to just pay off that debt. And not only to foreign bondholders, which include vulture funds in the United States, and the US legal system has basically forced the Argentine state to pay those vulture funds, but also, for instance, the International Monetary Fund gave Argentina the largest IMF loan in history at more than $50 billion, even though it knew that Argentina could not pay that off. And it's been widely reported that that was a political move by the Donald Trump administration in support of the conservative government in Argentina of Mauricio Macri. The point is that Argentina is constantly hemorrhaging its foreign currencies to service its debt, and that has led to a drastic decline in its foreign exchange reserves, which has made it very difficult for it to stabilize its currency. Its foreign exchange reserves are constantly running dangerously low. So this is one of the reasons. I mean, in Brazil, there was a similar history in the 1980s with the third world debt crisis. This is one of the factors why countries in the global south are seeking alternatives to the dollar, because they have been trapped in this debt in the past. And when the IMF and the World Bank come in, they have political conditionalities. You have to impose structural adjustment programs, which includes cutting healthcare and education and social spending and decreasing the minimum wage and privatizing state-owned assets. China does not have the same political conditionalities when it gives financing. And what we've interestingly seen is, one, an increase in the use of foreign currencies, in financing by institutions like, for instance, the New Development Bank, the BRICS Bank, and the former president of Brazil, Dilma Rousseff, is now the new president of the New Development Bank. And she has pledged that at least 30% of the financing that the NDB gives to countries will be denominated in the debt of the members of the NDB, not in dollars. And furthermore, China has actually been kind of quietly been developing a new form of loans, essentially. It's not necessarily new, but it's been increasing in use, which is currency swap lines. So, for instance, Argentina, the Argentine Central Bank, and the People's Bank of China just did a currency swap line agreement in which the Argentine Central Bank takes Chinese Yuan and uses it to pay for imports of Chinese products. And Argentina is talking about de-dollarizing its trade with China. So there's a political will, but I do want to stress one point here briefly, which is that in Latin America, the economists designing the system are very well educated. Many of them, are PhDs, and they include, for instance, Luis Arce, the economist, former economic minister, who's the president of Bolivia, and also in Ecuador, the potential future president, Andrés Arauz, who has a PhD in economics. One of the things that they've stressed constantly when they talk about this plan for a pan-Latin American currency is it's not going to be like the euro. It is not going to be the national currency used by countries. It's going to be an international unit of account that is used for international trade, modeled on the idea of the bond core, which was proposed by the well-known economist John Maynard Keynes in the Bretton Woods Conference in 1944 as an alternative to the US dollar.
Okay. We're down to our last minute and a half already. So, Andrew, I mean, pick up on that, though. And then where does China actually see its role in these new currencies and developing these new ways for certain countries to kind of avoid the traps of having to rely on the US dollar? Where's China going now?
Well, definitely China is not going to open up its capital market anytime soon, because China doesn't believe in the applicability of the Western open system to its own economy. But on the other hand, as I pointed out, the trends are unmistakable for an alternative trading currency. I again stress the word trading currency is distinct from a reserve currency. Now, as more and more people trade with China, they need to build up the kind of commonly regarded trading currency, and it will affect the position of the US dollar in terms of the proportion of the international reserve system. Now, the fundamental dilemma of the US dollar as an international reserve currency is the so-called Griffin's dilemma, dating back to the Belgian economists, in the sense that the monetary policy underpinned by the US dollar, of course, is just Americans' own policy, but as an international reserve currency, is affecting other economies, as pointed out just now, is affecting economies in Latin America, which have different set of economic, challenges. And so this is another fundamental kind of dilemma of the US dollar. And then in addition to unbridled sanctions, the United States is confiscating other people's money. For example, Russia, Afghanistan, and other countries. So the developing world is getting more worried about the trustworthiness of the US dollar.
Noted. Andrew, unfortunately, I'm going to have to interrupt you because we are completely out of time. For this edition of the Newsmakers, I could see our other two panelists, though, did agree with very much of what you said just there. But thanks so much, all three of you, for being with me, and our viewers, of course, for joining us as well. Remember, you can follow us on Twitter, and do be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Andrea Sankey. We'll see you next time.